Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're going to be going over game number 2 from the 1971 Candidates Tournament. Winner of this tournament goes on to face Buddy Spassky in the 1972 World Chess Championships. Our competitors, we have Bobby Fischer. He is the underdog, facing off against Petrosian, who just lost the World Championship to Buddy Spassky a few years ago. He feels like the title is his. A few years prior to that, he beat Buddy Spassky, and so he's looking to make it 3 World Championships in a row that he faces off against Buddy Spassky. But he does have one roadblock in his way, and that is Bobby Fischer, much younger kid than Petrosian at this time. Bobby Fischer in this tournament had won 12 games to reach the finals of the Candidates Tournament, and so Petrosian, understanding that his opponent has had a good time so far, feels like he's going to dominate. But in game number 1, Bobby Fischer came out swinging and won game number 1. So in game number 2 here, Petrosian has the white pieces, looking to assert himself as the dominant player. Bobby Fischer looking to stay aggressive as always, see if he can take a 2-0 lead. Petrosian starts out with d4. This goes into the Grunfeld defense with knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, and then d5. Now white has a couple options here. You could always take here for the exchange variation. He opts for the safer alternative, and that is just bringing his bishop here to f4. Bobby Fischer continues with bishop to g7, just fianchetting his bishop to the king side of the board. e3, just solidifying this pawn chain. Once the dark square bishop's outside this pawn chain, pretty safe to play e3. Also opens up for his light square bishop to defend this square here on c4 in case Bobby Fischer wants to take here on c4. We see Bobby Fischer continue with c5, and then the pawn takes, and then queen down to a5. This is pinning down the knight here to the king. Can easily take the pawn here on c5 if he wants to. Now Petrosian does have a few options here. The first one would be just to go ahead and take with his pawn here on d5. Glad he didn't choose this option. This is a pretty drawish variation because it tends to end in a perpetual check. After the knight takes, we can see the queen take. You can just see a lot of material start to come off the board after the pawn recaptures. The queen is forking the king and the rook here. The rook's going to fall off the board. Bishop's going to come here to e5, attacking both the queen and the rook here. And so we're going to see the rook come off the board after the bishop comes to e6. The queen can come to b7, but black has perpetual check. There's no way for Petrosian to do anything about this. If he were ever to come to g3, well, that's going to be checkmate right there. That's not good. So he's going to come back to e2, and then we just repeat this entire thing over and over. So glad he didn't choose that option. Other option he had is queen to a4, and just says, let's go exchange material off the board. That's fine. I'll have my knight come here to a4. You could play d7, force my knight come back. We kind of are just resetting the exact same position, except we don't have the queens on the board, and Bobby Fischer has a few more pieces evolved into the game. So I really like this position from Bobby Fischer. And then the other option is to have the queen come to b3. It isn't doing as much. Castle on the king side, and you can see rook over here to c1. Petrosian doesn't really want to play a perpetual check game, doesn't want to play an option where Bobby Fischer has more developed pieces, and he's pretty much at the same spot as before, except the queens are off the board. That's not what you're looking for with the white pieces. He chooses option D, and that is just to go ahead and play his rook to c1. Yes, queen to b3 is completely fine. It does also stop this light square bishop from getting involved into the game, because then the queen is threatening coming up here to b7, but decides for right now to go and just play rook here to c1. Bobby Fischer brings his knight down here to e4. It's a great little outpost for this knight, and the knight can't take here. It's still being pinned down by the queen. So Petrosian decides to go ahead and take the pawn away that's protecting that knight, and that's exactly what he does with pawn takes here on d5. And then knight takes on c3, and then queen to d2. Says this, I'm going to get this material back. You can't move your knight right away. I'll just go ahead and take your queen right here. So instead, the queen comes down here to a2. This was protected before by the knight here on c3. As soon as that comes off the board, the pawn on a2 is a sitting duck. So that's exactly what we see here. Now the pawn takes does open up for the queen to attack this. Bobby Fischer could easily exchange material. That's not necessarily what he's looking to do right here. Still trying to be pretty aggressive. I think in his mind, he feels like he's the better player. He won game 1. He's now won 13 games in a row in the Canada's tournament. He's trying to make a statement to the world right now. Not really looking to trade off material. Brings his queen back here to a5. Now bishop c4. Knight here to d7. Knight here to e2. Just getting the knights involved into the game. And then knight to e5, and Petrosian has a couple options. He could retreat his bishop back here to a2, or he could just go ahead and take material and just say, yes, I'll give up my bishop pawn or bishop pair here after the bishop captures here. I can start pushing forward with his pawn, and this makes a lot of sense. If the pawn takes here, yes, there's double pawns on the c-file, but starting to get up the board, and Bobby Fischer's going to have to spend a lot of time trying to make sure this pawn does not push any further up the board. Instead, he decides to go ahead and bring his bishop back here to a2. This is being protected by the queen here on d2. Still defending this square here on d5. Just says, I don't want to give up my bishop pair quite yet. Now, Bobby Fischer had different options. I think even the better move for Bobby Fischer right now is just go and take this pawn here on c5. You don't have to worry about it anymore. Eventually, Petrosian's going to push forward with c6. But Bobby Fischer really likes to get material involved into the game, even if it is a slightly worse move. He just feels like he has a better opportunity with more attacking pieces. That's exactly what he does. Plays bishop down here to f5. Then we see the bishop take here on e5. Petrosian says, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and give up that bishop pair. There's just too much material that Bobby Fischer has in the center of the board. I have to do something about that. So Bobby Fischer now has a bishop pair. Definitely something you generally don't want to give Bobby Fischer. Knight up here to d4, attacking the bishop. And now we see the queen take here on c5 and says, yeah, if you want to go and take my bishop, that's fine. Bishop comes off the board, and then pawn recaptures here on f5. So we do see black with the bishop or the pawn, the double pawns here on the f-file. Petrosian has given up his double pawns here on the c-file. From white side, we do have 6 pawns, and then on black side, we do have 6 pawns as well. But you can also see that Petrosian still has a pretty easy way to castle on the king side. Bobby Fischer does not. So not a lot of king safety here. He has to be pretty aware of the vulnerability that his king has. Also does not have the best pawn structure. So if you're kind of looking at what side is better right now, it does look like white has a better setup heading into the endgame. White decides it's time to go ahead and castle on the king side of the board, followed by queen to a5, attacking the pawn. If the pawn moves, the queen's going to fall. Wants to make sure that this pawn doesn't continue to push forward. This is a semi-open file with the rook here on c1, so it's definitely a threat this pawn can start to push. Just a lot of pressure on Bobby Fischer he has to deal with. Also just says, hey, if this queen moves, I'm going to go ahead and take your bishop. Petrosian continues with queen c2. Defends all the same squares, also attacks this pawn here on f5. Black pushes that forward with f4. And now c4, as we talked about before, pushing that pawn here on the c-file. We see the pawn take on e3. Petrosian's not too worried about it. He could easily recapture if he wanted to, but he decides, let's go ahead and push that pawn. This is my best way for victory. Queen down here to d2. Queen up to a4. Says, yeah, I don't want to exchange right now. I have a threat. I'm going to push it as much as possible. King to f8. We already knew Bobby Fischer was not going to be castling on the king side, so he just decides to go ahead and move his king here to f8. And then rook here to d1, attacking the queen. Queen to e2. And then pawn d6, putting a lot of pressure on black here. Queen to h5, and this is threatening the queen down here to h2. And I think in this position, white almost freaked out because of that. Because yes, your opponent does threaten mate in 1, but you can just play pawn takes here on e7 check. They have to respond to that. King here to g7, then you could take with your pawn. If they come down here to h2, that's fine. You could play king f2. They don't have any more threats right now. They might want to come back here to h4, but they can't because the queen just come over here. It is protecting the entire 4th rank. So that is probably the option he should have gone with. He kind of freaks out a little bit, decides to go ahead and play pawn to f4. Says, yeah, I don't even care if you push your pawn to e2. That's exactly what Bobby Fischer does. Unfortunately for him, it's not the situation that he's thinking, and not really sure if he just didn't calculate everything or if he just forgot about this lonely piece over here on a2. But we see the bishop fall here on e5. Pawn takes here on d1, gets the queen. Rook takes here on d1. Queen takes on e5, no real other option for the queen to do. But then rook to f1. Now the bishop and the rook are both eyeing down this pawn here on f7. Bobby Fischer does not have his other rooks involved into the game. So it's really just the queen, the bishop, and the rook eyeing down the king, which is in the center of the board, versus Bobby Fischer's queen. You can see where this is going. It's not very good for Bobby Fischer. He plays f6, trying to stop the immediate threat here of the rook taking on f7, but that's just met with queen to b3, threatening again queen up here to f7. No real way to stop this. We see king g7, queen up here to f7. Now the pawn takes on e7, and the reason that's important is that pawn was protecting this pawn on f6. Now you could easily have the rook come here to f6 if you want. You could have the queen come, another option as well. But then we see pawn to f5 says, yeah, I don't want to have you take my pawn and check my king here. Rook takes, queen to d4, checking the king. But after the king comes to h1, there's no other threats that Bobby Fischer has. Yes, he could always come down here to something like d1 or a1, but as soon as he does, we see rook down to f1. This is stopping the threat, and it has protection from this queen. So Bobby Fischer ends up losing. Petrosian's got to feel pretty good. Comes back with the white pieces, has established himself as the dominant player that he feels like he is in this tournament. So first two games, holding serve here. Everyone that has white has won. So thank you guys so much for watching. We're all tied up after game number 2. We'll come back in the next video and look at game number 3 from the 1971 Canada's tournament between Petrosian and Bobby Fischer.